Okay, so we're back to another chapter, a chapter known as An Uneasy Peace, and we are continuing our talk through the years leading up to the Civil War. Today we're gonna get all the way up to 1850, to the Compromise of 1850. So we're going to kind of steamroll through a couple of decades here, kind of the late 1830s and 1840s. We have already talked about the Spanish-American War. Sorry, no, we haven't. We have talked all the way already about the Mexican-American War, but not the Spanish-American War will not come until much later, 1898. But we need to talk about what the nation is doing to try and begin the conversation of slavery. Remember, there's a gag rule on the congressional floor, which makes it impossible to discuss the issue whatsoever in Congress. So that doesn't make things very easy in terms of trying to solve an issue that is going to rip the country apart. And by 1850, we truly do get a situation with the Compromise of 1850 where it's very, very obvious that slavery is going to be talked about. It's going to be a contentious issue. And it takes a major, major compromise by three of the most important senators of all of American history. These three guys, here they are, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. It takes all three of them working together to try and stave off a civil war in the year of 1850. So, anyway, we'll talk all about that. The big picture here is, why was the peace set up in the 1840s and 1850s not a lasting peace? This is kind of a loaded question because we actually won't really be able to answer that quite yet. We'll kind of answer that question as we go through the next couple of chapters. But you should know it's not a lasting peace. And you should see the cracks. Even when I start to teach that, even the Compromise of 1850, though it looks maybe polished on the outside, has several different cracks in it, which will enable it to be basically ignored pretty soon after it's written. Anyway, let's go back to the Mexican-American War, and remember that the territory of America is going to increase by 1/3 as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Once again, one of the best treaty names of all time. And this territory, of course, is going to be basically everything that is in this little dash area, right here, Wilmot Proviso. It says Wilmot Proviso. And of course, maybe West Texas here. All right, so this sort of area was won in the Mexican-American War, and there's a lot of debate over whether slavery should go there or not, okay? Southern Democrats are going to fight Northern Whigs over what to do. And abolitionists are worried about cotton in this new area. So abolitionists don't want cotton to spread all the way to the coast, right? That would clearly kind of make a purely slave South all the way across the southern boundary of America. Of course, here's the 3630 line, which was supposed to be the southern terminus, northern terminus of slavery. But as we can see, with Texas, it's crept a little bit above, and then the idea that it's supposed to go all the way out here, right? That seems like it's well above the 3630 line. So northern abolitionists are worried about that, and southerners fear losing power in Congress. So they don't want a bunch of free states being made out of this new territory. So the debate over whether Congress had the actual power to limit slavery is going to rage on and on. There is a precedent for that, though, okay, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, the 4 remedies to slavery, there's 4 things that were actual legitimate ways of getting out of war. Okay, Civil War is not seen as a remedy to slavery in the U.S. at this point in 1846 to 1850. The first remedy was this idea of popular sovereignty. And this was simply the idea that the people of a given territory should have the right to vote and decide if slaves go there or not. Seems pretty democratic and common sense. The second, an amendment. So amend the Constitution to either eradicate slavery completely or keep it in all territories or whatever. So actually get into the Constitution and make it, basically written in stone almost forever that this is what slavery is going to look like inside the United States. Third is nullification. Okay, so giving the states to nullify an act of Congress if they choose to prohibit slavery in any one of these would-be states. And 4, of course, is secession, okay, which is leaving the Union. Secession is not the same thing as Civil War, okay? I want to make sure to keep that in mind. Even when South Carolina secedes in 1860. All right, so those are the four possible remedies here that we're trying to deal with. Now, let's get into this Wilmot's proviso business here. This guy is David Wilmot. Here he is, right here. David Wilmot is from Pennsylvania, okay? And he, though kind of, he's a racist for the time period. He does live in a state that's free, but he doesn't necessarily care about the plight of the black man in America. He's not an abolitionist, but he does fight against slavery, okay? Purely on the grounds that it's spreading the power of the southern states, okay? And this proviso, this Wilmot's proviso that he sends into Congress, basically says that slavery or involuntary servitude should never exist in the new lands won in the Mexican-American War, okay? So he does not think that slavery should spread. He feels like the South has had its day, and that is enough. Okay, Wilmot is angered, and many of the North is angered by President Polk at this time period. Many in the North feel like his agenda has dominated politics, and the South is dominating politics, even though it doesn't necessarily have the same amount of people. Polk had lowered tariffs and denied funds for internal improvements, which is going to hurt industrialists in the North. So once again, Polk is from the South, so we have to remember that as well. He is an expansionist president. That's how he runs and wins. So he's also getting the Western vote. But there starts to be some sort of idea from the Northerners, led by David Wilmot, that perhaps the South is basically biting off more than they can chew, and they're dominating American politics in a way they shouldn't. Needless to say, Wilmot's proviso never becomes a law. Otherwise, it would be called an act or a law, right? It's just a proviso. It did pass the House. It's voted through the House several times. But the Senate, because it's equally divided between slave and free states, never actually has a majority ruling. It is never able to actually break a tie. So, it basically dies on the Senate floor. But the voting on the Wilmot Proviso shows that the gag rule can no longer be enforced, and that slavery is going to be on everyone's tongue, regardless of whether the president or citizens want it to be or not. So that's the way things are going to roll out. From that standpoint, in 1846, slavery will become a major policy decision that politicians will try to take a stand on. Now, back to popular sovereignty. The precedent that had been set so far by Congress is that, indeed, the national government could prohibit slavery in new territories. Remember, the Northwest Ordinance, even before the Constitution was written, prohibited all slavery from all the new lands gained north of basically the southern states in existence, through the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, over to the Mississippi River, north of the Ohio River is what I meant to say. Okay, so Congress has a pass of making sure that certain territories never, ever get slavery. But the South didn't necessarily agree with this, as you can imagine. They think that slaves can be brought into all the states, no matter the law. And the reason why they say this is because before these states are states, they're territories. And a territory is not sovereign. It's basically owned by all of the people in the United States and the government of the United States. So the idea from the South, and this will be kind of put forward by John C. Calhoun, is that it's not against the law to bring a slave into a territory because there are no laws in that territory, which is actually a pretty clever maneuvering around the law. Okay? So the idea was, well, if we're going to follow popular sovereignty, then while a state is not a state, it's a territory, slave owners will bring in slaves by the hundreds and the thousands and basically push out all of the people who are free, or the people who don't own slaves, or the people who support a free state. What we end up getting here, and we'll talk about this next chapter, is a really intense and violent conflict in Kansas. I'm actually going to call it the Bloody Kansas conflict. But the idea for many in the United States, the idea was that popular sovereignty would be great, right? It seemed to champion the idea of democracy, but the problem is that it's very difficult to put into practice. How do you vote on this? Is it going to be a clear majority? Is it going to be a two-thirds majority? What happens if it votes for free and there are still people who own land in a territory that becomes a state? Do they have to leave? So it's very, very, the actual semantics of the voting are very, very unclear. And, this is one of this political cartoon that you've been staring at right here is a great kind of picture of how many thought that slavery was being jammed down their mouth, right? Forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. And a free soiler would be simply one who believes that the soil should be free. In other words, that there should not be any slavery in a territory. And then here we have Stephen Douglas, the major champion of popular sovereignty, basically saying, hey, by following a policy of popular sovereignty, and it'll effect make slavery be jammed down your throat. You'll be forced to live with it inside of your state, even though this person supports a free nation. So this idea of people who are supporters of the free North having to live side by side with slave owners does not meld. And eventually it's seen as better to actually live in a state where at least everybody is one or the other. They're either supporters of slaves or not. It turns out that popular sovereignty is one of the worst things that could have happened to decide this issue. And it really, really backfired. Now, the election of 1848, that was the next presidential election after Polk. This is going to see a Whig candidate, Zachary Taylor, okay, beat out the Democratic candidate, Lewis Cass, and Martin Van Buren. And Zachary Taylor, who actually, if you remember, was a general during the Mexican-American War, was able to win this election because he basically doesn't talk about slavery at all. He lets Martin Van Buren and Lewis Cass basically argue it amongst themselves, and he kind of avoids the issue completely. Now, being from Louisiana, he, of course, would have been a slave supporter and a slave owner, but he doesn't engage in the slavery debate, and as a result, he basically is able to march through with the win in this election and kind of, as we say, kick the ball down the road or kick the rock down the road to the next president. All right, so now comes a time for talk about the great triumvirate, or the three senatorial giants, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. So just a little background where these guys are from, if you've forgotten. Henry Clay is from Kentucky, John C. Calhoun is from South Carolina, and Daniel Webster is from Massachusetts. None of these guys are ever president, but collectively they're actually more important. They make more of an impact than any president of the era, save Andrew Jackson. And they're able to keep the Union together by a series of amazing compromises that really culminate in the Compromise of 1850. Now, this whole debate starts with California, and here's an old map of California. I love old maps. It's actually cut up in kind of the current county system we see here, color-coded and all that sort of stuff. I love how mountains are drawn, right? They just kind of look like little clouds that kind of like they stuck down on the land. Anyway, these are the Sierra Nevadas, of course. They're not necessarily in the right position, but at least they knew there were mountains there. Anyway, so the big debate is over California, and when gold rush settlers flooded into California, they didn't take that many slaves because, if you remember, California used to be owned by Mexico, and Mexico had prohibited slavery in 1829. So there aren't many slaves in California, and yet part of it is actually down below this 3630 line. So it's kind of a weird state. In fact, I think a whole 2/3 of it is going to be below the 3630 line. So Southerners are saying, well, it technically, should be part slave and maybe part free, right? We've already seen that maybe popular sovereignty isn't going to work. Now, each of these three senatorial giants is going to have a little different perspective. Henry Clay wants compromise above all else, and he's going to put forward up to 8 proposals to his colleagues to try and figure out what to do with this problem. John C. Calhoun said that any compromise would betray the South, and that he said that the South needed federal protection for slavery. All right, and he basically predicts doom. He's actually on his deathbed at the time, and he predicts that basically nothing's going to work, and that basically this is going to be the point where the South will split off from the North. Then Daniel Webster actually strangely pleaded with Northerners to accept the Southern demands. He withdraws his support for the Wilmot Proviso, and he moves towards Clay's proposals. So there's kind of this abandonment from one of these senatorial giants of the Northern appeal. And there's this sense that if the North can maybe just keep giving in to Southern demands, maybe one last time, they can preserve the Union for, maybe until slavery could naturally die out. Okay. Now, Clay eventually has to end up leaving the debate because of illness. And Zachary Taylor actually dies of food poisoning not that long into office. So his vice president, Millard Fillmore, takes over. Millard Fillmore is much more willing to compromise. Okay. And the Compromise of 1850 is eventually hammered out and passed on the congressional floor. And these are the major provisions of this. First, California is admitted to the Union as the 16th free state. And it basically upsets the balance between slave and free. There will be no slave state that will be brought in to even this out in the short run. But Utah and New Mexico, all right, there will be no federal restrictions on slavery in those states. Okay. Texas will lose its controversial boundary claim that it had with New Mexico, but got $10 million in compensation. In Washington, D.C., slavery is maintained, but the slave trade is prohibited. And then finally, there is a very strong fugitive slave law that is put into action. And basically it said that Northerners had to return runaway slaves under penalty of federal law. So these are the major provisions. And this chart's pretty great. Is it also shows who it is a victory for each point, right? So California admitted, clear victory for the North. Popular sovereignty, all right, to determine the slavery issue in Utah and New Mexico territories. That is going to be a moderate for both sides, but generally it's actually going to be slightly a victory for the South because it's below that 3630 line, although it is super deserty, so cotton's not going to be able to grow in these areas. Moderate Southern victory to have Texas receive money and to give some territory up to New Mexico. Slave trade is a moderate Northern victory in that the trade is abolished and slave states will lose some power in Washington, D.C. And the clear victory for the South is going to be the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, who wins? Really, who wins at the end of the day? Your textbook makes the point that the North seemed to gain the most. Specifically, they gain an immediate edge in the Senate with this admission of California as a free state with no countering as a slave state. That's a clear victory, okay? As you've also seen, the major clear victory for the South will be this strong federal enforcement of a new Fugitive Slave Act. But what do you think the North is going to do with this new act? You guessed it. They're going to ignore it. They're not going to enforce it. Okay? So, there's going to be no arrests that are going to be made, federal arrests, en masse at least, and charges of not upholding the Fugitive Slave Act, which of course will make Southerners irate. So overall, we say the Compromise of 1850 is actually a pretty clear victory for the North, and it really does signal to the South the tide has shifted. All of this, supposed Northern abandonment of their ideas to kind of meet the South halfway actually doesn't come to fruition because this Fugitive Slave Act never gets enforced. And we'll see it'll take another decade to get to actual civil war, but there's almost immediate unrest from the South as a result of this compromise. Another thing that I like a lot about this chart here is that it shows the results, right, and reactions of events in the 1840s. So you can look at what happened as a result of victory in the Mexican-American War, the Wilmot Proviso, right? Trying to use the gag rule to avoid slavery issues, right? Popular sovereignty and the Whig Party nomination, right? So take a look at this chart as well, and you can see kind of how America is dividing even more as a result of these events that are happening even before the compromise starts. Anyway, that's it for an uneasy piece. We'll come back this week and we'll talk about Bloody Kansas and the final events leading up to the Civil War. Good luck with your questions.